My last video covered the three main subtypes in the MAGA movement: Christian nationalist, aggrieved populist, and technofascist. This video is going to be zooming in on technofascist, their belief system, their policy prescriptions, and why those prescriptions are ultimately unworkable and self-contradictory. I'm also going to run through what the psychological function of these beliefs are, both from a larger perspective and in an individual sense. This topic is big enough that I'm going to divide this into two videos. This video is going to cover the Neoreactionism movement, its core figures and beliefs, and the psychological function that these beliefs serve. Neoreactionism is a far-right, anti-democratic political ideology that emerged out of Silicon Valley in the late 2000s. Its ideas are that democracy is an illusion, so any kind of democracy will eventually lead to societal decline, that hierarchy is natural within human society, and that a small group of people should rule over everybody else, that nations should be run like corporations with a CEO or king-like figure at the top making all the decisions, and that progressivism is a kind of disease. So equality, mass movements, programs that make everyday average people's lives better are a kind of cancer on society. Neoreactionism, or NRx, is the term that was coined by software engineer Curtis Yarvin and has percolated from the far fringes to pretty much the mainstream, having at this point influenced the likes of billionaires Peter Thiel, Mark Andreessen, the former Coinbase CTO Balaji Srinivasan, Elon Musk, and political figures like Steve Bannon and JD Vance. NRx grew out of three main intellectual threads. The first is libertarianism. Most of the thinkers in the NRx movement were libertarians or even leftist prior to switching over to the far right. The second includes reactionary thinkers of the 20th century. Some of these are James Burnham, whose 1941 work, The Managerial Revolution, stated that no matter what the political system, elites, that could be technocrats, bureaucrats, or corporate heads, would always be in control. Then there's Samuel Francis, whose paleoconservatism movement pushed for a right-wing authoritarian takeover of most major institutions. And then there's Carl Schmitt, who was a Nazi law theorist, and he has been incredibly influential on Peter Thiel especially, and perhaps even on JD Vance's recent assertion that the federal judiciary has no authority over the executive branch, because Schmitt advocated for what he called the state of exception, and that is that the ruler or leader of a nation should have the authority to call for a state of exception wherein the laws of that country would no longer apply. The third thread is accelerationism, and that was coined by the philosopher Nick Land, and in the original meaning, it is to accelerate capitalism and technology as far as possible, no matter the consequences. NRx actually takes this further and says, let's accelerate the decline of democracy so that a new right-wing authoritarian tech-based order can take over when democracy collapses. I'm going to run over four key concepts of NRx that most of the folks pushing for this agenda are trying to implement in various ways. Number one is the cathedral, which is the idea that liberal progressive elites control academia, the media, and governance in order to push a soft thought control system promoting egalitarianism, human rights, and democracy. Now, NRx thinkers think that this is some kind of religious dogma that is bad and is ultimately promoting mediocrity. They want to tear the cathedral down and replace it with something autocratic and hegemonic. Two is corporate monarchy. This is the idea that countries should be run like corporations with a CEO king at the top. This person would make all decisions. They would have no checks and balances. There would be no direct civic participation in governance. This would supposedly lead to countries being run efficiently and rationally, but essentially is just another way of spinning autocracy. Three is patchwork, or breaking up nations into privately owned city-states. This is the idea that instead of a big country with a centralized government, you would break up countries into small city-states that would be privately held, run like corporations, and that individual people would, quote unquote, opt into the governments that suited them best. In practice, this looks more like governance by the super rich. 4 is exit. So instead of reform, leave. And this is the idea that instead of trying to work to make democracy better and work for more people, we should in fact quit and found different societies based on a more hierarchical, autocratic model. So this can look like anything from Balaji Srinivasan's network states to Peter Thiel's seasteads to Elon Musk's Mars colonies. But what psychological function do beliefs like this actually have? The longing for total autonomy and control, especially inside of a space that's completely self-contained, isolated from external threats or pressures or uncertainty, where all needs are met without any struggle, is oftentimes in psychoanalysis a longing for a return to the womb. So a pre-subjective state where everything is given to one without having to go through any type of struggle to attain it. The monarch and the patchwork city-state is also a longing to seal oneself off from the mess that is social interaction, other humans, and systems of governance that pretty much demand inefficiency in order to be able to reach any kind of compromise between the people living in a society. This is exactly why seasteading or patchwork states or network states or Mars colonies are so appealing to these folks, because they are about manufacturing an artificial womb that one can inject oneself into and be completely exempt from any of the things, the inherent messiness of the human condition. NRx can also be seen from this perspective as being a trauma response both to modernity and the messiness inherent in modernity itself, but also to the folks who are involved in the movement and their personal life histories. So the majority of these folks, so that's everybody from Thiel, Musk, Yarvin, JD Vance, they all have histories of bullying, of being pushed out of groups they wanted to belong to, but those people didn't want to have them for various reasons. And this is another reason why injecting yourself into this idea of a wholly controlled reality where you are the one in charge, you are the elite, you are the one who has all of the power, is so salient to these people's worldview. It is essentially about a reaction to rejection. Importantly, this gets into the revenge aspect and the sadistic aspect as well, because NRx is not just about governance. It is about watching the world that you have rage quit fall apart, and thereby gaining a sense of superiority, and as you on your self-built viewing platform get to watch the world that you hate burn down. This gets into a salient contradiction in tech disruption, in that most of these ideas, though they're presented as being innovative, are actually very regressive and are repackaging extremely old ideas and systems in a new shiny wrapper. So this is not anything new here. This is just being dressed up by folks to look as if it's something new. In the next part of the video, I'm going to get into 2 stories that parallel a lot of these ideas and illustrate why they are ultimately unworkable and self-defeating in addition to being self-contradictory. Those 2 stories are 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea and Edgar Allan Poe's The Mask of the Red Death. So I'll catch you on that one. 2 stories that parallel the neoreactionism or technofascist anti-utopias, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea and The Mask of the Red Death. Imagine that you are deep beneath the ocean, encased in a glimmering submarine, held captive by a charismatic but homicidal captain who is about to kill a ship full of people he thinks is out to get him. My eyes did not leave the captain, who with his hands stretched out to sea was watching with a glowing eye the glorious wreck. It was no common misanthropy which had shut Captain Nemo and his companions within the Nautilus, but a hatred, either monstrous or sublime, which time can never weaken. Did this hatred still seek for vengeance? Captain Nemo imposed silence, saying, "I am the law, and I am the judge. I am the oppressed, and there is the oppressor. Through him I have lost all that I loved, cherished, and venerated. I saw all perish. All that I hate is there. Say no more." These are the conditions that the narrator finds himself in Jules Verne's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. And essentially, it's the same conditions that anyone would face if confronted with the reality of being a part of a neo-fascistic anti-utopia. The French philosopher Michel Foucault, in his article on Jules Verne, talked about Verne's obsession with closed, controlled spaces, of which the Nautilus, Nemo's ship, is a perfect example. The Nautilus is an autocratic microcosm in that the captain, the ruler, is both the sovereign and the prisoner. He never leaves this space. It's a rejection of the outside world in that it is fully enclosed and apart from any type of democratic process or external involvement. It's also an archive of total knowledge in that everything about this world that Nemo has created is completely ordered and known. There is no randomness, there is no chaos, there is nothing that can permeate the shell. NRx's patchwork and exit strategies are complementary to this in that they are also wholly enclosed worlds that these folks hope to create in order to escape from the messiness of human life. In addition, the dream of a CEO monarchy is the dream of an entirely closed, rational, non-negotiable order. Seasteading is also a direct descendant of this fantasy, and Mars colonies would be essentially the same thing, just more remote. When reading Balaji or Yarvin, they often describe democracy as the open ocean, so chaotic and ungovernable, as opposed to autocratic technocracies, which they think of as closed systems which are sealed off from the turbulence of democracy. Edgar Allan Poe's The Masque of the Red Death is another literary parallel to the NRx nightmare, in that it shows how no world can be wholly impermeable by the outside world. In Poe's story, Prince Prospero, a feudal lord, and his court decide to flee a dying world being gripped by a highly transmissible plague by sealing themselves off in a lavish, enclosed fortress. Inside of this, they think that they can survive for as long as they need to. The tastes of the Duke were peculiar. He had a fine eye for colors and effects. He disregarded the decora of mere fashion. His plans were bold and fiery, and his conceptions glowed with barbaric luster. There are some who would have thought him mad. His followers felt that he was not. It was necessary to hear and see and touch him to be sure that he was not. As the revelry inside reaches a fever pitch and the masses outside are suffering and dying, one night they hold a grand masquerade ball. At the very height of midnight, it's clear that the Red Death has entered the fortress and proceeds to kill them one by one. These two stories illustrate from a literary perspective how NRx is advocating for policies and structures that at their core are unworkable and based in psychological avoidance. They are fantasies of control in the face of a world that feels uncontrollable. They are hyper-rational in an effort to avoid vulnerability, hence the obsession with efficiency, rationality, and meritocracy. And they're a retreat from the social into the mechanical, hence their ideal world is a corporation, a bunker, or a sealed-off city-state. The early tech utopias, so between the 70s and early 2010s, at least paid lip service to the idea of egalitarianism, that engineers and creatives should have a voice, and so they attracted idealists who were really interested in the idea of open governance and decentralization and leveraging this type of technological power to make more people's lives better. However, over time, those people started to demand things, so worker rights or AI oversight, accountability, and the tech czars decided, well, that's too much of a liability. That's when we started to see mass layoffs, union busting, and Twitter-style purges that went from we're all in this together to you're lucky to have a job in my fiefdom. The network state is an extension of this logic. It allows crypto-libertarians to have a fantasy world where they never have to deal with meddlesome employees or outside regulators or democratic oversight ever again. And it's wildly self-defeating. The original ethos of Silicon Valley, as imperfect as it was that everybody was in it together, moving toward solving problems for real people. When you see this kind of systematic dismantling, then the people who are capable of real innovation are walking away. They're not going to stick around. You don't get another Xerox PARC in a world where every company is run like Twitter under Elon. Even if a network state got off the ground, it would quickly collapse under its own contradictions. What happens when the founder loses interest? How do you deal with ideological differences that would inevitably emerge? How do you keep it from becoming the same kind of bureaucratic mess that it set out to escape? For those of us who remember the debacle of Biosphere 2, which was a scientific experiment in the 90s that tested whether humans could live in a closed-loop society like the ones being proposed in NRx, it collapsed completely. The artificial ecosystem couldn't be controlled in the way that scientists expected. The oxygen levels dropped precipitously. Everyone lost a ton of weight because the food was insufficient. And the crew ended up splitting into two factions, one of which wouldn't talk to the other one at all. This is highly persuasive that total exit from the outside world is impossible. Systems are too complex to predict every variable, and they are still dependent on the systems in which they sit. They're also very permeable, and it's easy for them to become cross-contaminated. Even highly trained, rational people, scientists, not cultists, descended into factionalism under extreme pressure. So you can think of this as human psychology plus resource scarcity equals division and dissolution. If a meticulously planned scientific environment couldn't sustain itself, then a tech bro kingdom in the middle of the ocean definitely wouldn't. I'm not saying Event Horizon, but Event Horizon. Sidebar, guess who was appointed CEO of Biosphere after its staff was purged after the aborted mission? Yes, that's Steve Bannon. Ultimately, their ideas show that technofascists do not like humanity in any meaningful way. They are not attracted or interested or curious about humans in their complex, autonomous, contradictory, awe-inspiring selves. They want to optimize people, streamline communities, and engineer away inefficiencies that actually make human life strange, unpredictable, and exciting. For them, culture is a bug to be patched, disagreement is an inefficiency to be engineered away, and complex social interactions should be reduced to transactions. The whole thing reeks of an extreme need for validation, and their actual audience is not the techno-citizens that they claim to be liberating. It's their investor circles, other billionaires, and the people that they respect, which is a vanishingly small group. One can say that they lack the capacity for awe, which is the ability to just sit with complexity without trying to solve it or reduce it to something known and quantifiable. They'll never build anything genuinely new or interesting because all they try to do is to tame the world, reorganize it in their own image, and extract power from it to exercise over others. Psychologist Erich Fromm said that the psychic task which a person can and must set is not to feel secure, but to be able to tolerate insecurity without panic and undue fear. What we see from technofascism is panic and fear in the face of insecurity. The task that's set out for all of us if we want to move beyond immature coping mechanisms is to be able to hold our discomfort, fear, and panic without pushing it onto others.